Okay, so I'll start it off, and we're gonna ask you what you consider your geek cred. It doesn't have to be what you're most known for. It's kind of what you love that if, let's say you had nothing else in the world, you'd be like, I'm a geek because.
Oh, I got like 30 of those, but I'll pick one. Yeah. Are we starting off with that now, or?
Yeah, let's do that. So, let's go. We'll dive right in. We'll keep it casual.
Geek cred. When I was 12 years old, my middle school librarian was a secretary for a couple of clubs of professional writers, and one of them, she used to bring me to the meetings. And at 12, I got to meet and later be mentored by Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson.
That's so cool.
So that was cool. And when I was 10, I snuck into the movies to see the world premiere of Night of the Living Dead. I mean, the world premiere. And later on became good friends with George Romero. And we even did a book together. And I became friends with Stan Lee. So I've got geek cred that is, I had nothing to do with that happening. It just kind of like came to me, but I embrace it.
Yeah.
That's something to be proud of. Super cool. All right, Matt, do you want to kick it off? Because Matt and I both finished the book.
Oh, cool.
Yes.
We're hoping you'll tell us. And great.
Okay, yeah. Because we're doing the audio version, I might as well kick it off. We're going to talk to Jonathan here, Jonathan Maberry, about Kagen the Damned, which is his new kind of epic sword and sorcery fantasy book. Although fantasy, we'll talk about that as the interview goes on. I don't want to spoil anything for anybody that hasn't read it yet, but we'll ask questions as we go on as best we can that won't spoil it for anybody, because there's some really fun stuff in this book. And just for anybody that is completely unaware coming into this interview, Jonathan is one of Jenny and I's favorite authors. He is a Bram Stoker Award winner. He's a New York Times bestseller. He's written for Marvel Comics. He's got his series. He's got the Joe Ledger series. He's got two different zombie series, which is the Rotten Ruin series and the Dead of Night series. And I know the titles of the books. Oh, I know Dead Man's Song, and I'm forgetting.
Pine Deep Trilogy.
Thank you, Pine Deep Trilogy. Holy moly!
Those were my first books, in fact.
Yes, they were, and I just had a complete blank on them, even though I love Pine Deep Trilogy. That's the name. So, and now he is getting into sword and sorcery after doing action, adventure, sci-fi, horror. He's really trying to cover it all. So, Jonathan, first, why don't you start off? Just kind of curious. What brought you to epic fantasy? Have you always loved epic fantasy, or was it just something that maybe you wanted to try after doing all these other things? Where does Kagen the Damned come from?
A bit of a long and winding road. I mean, first off, for those who are watching this on video, you'll be able to see where I'm pointing. For those who are not, I'll explain it. Up there is the very first book I ever bought with my own money, Conan the Wanderer, 1968, 60 cents, Lancer Books. So I jumped into epic fantasy back when it was called Swords and Sorcery, before it became either high fantasy or epic fantasy. And I read all the Conan stuff. I read all the Cull and Bran McMorn and his other stories, and everything I could find that was epic fantasy or Sword and Sorcery, I read. Fafhrd the Grey Mouser by Fritz Leiber, Jarell Joyry by C.L. Moore, the first female Sword and Sorcery character. And then, just going through the decades, Stephen R. Donaldson, his Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, probably the least likable protagonist ever in fiction, deliberately done. I mean, the guy is a total asshole, and yet he's the protagonist of that series of books. And very brave of Donaldson to do that. Carl Edward Wagner's Kane novels, which are brilliant, So I've been reading a lot of epic fantasy my whole life. I didn't think I was ever going to write any. I did a couple short stories, because authors get invited to anthologies a lot. So I've done a couple of epic fantasy short stories. But then one of those weird things happened at MacMillan, which is a division of at St. Martin's Griffin, which is a division of MacMillan. They had a meeting where they were saying, the publisher was meeting with the editors and saying that they wanted to have a deeper footprint in epic fantasy, because another imprint at MacMillan, Tor, has a pretty big stable of epic fantasy writers. And they asked, she asked the editors, who has a writer here who either is working on it or could be induced to work on it. And everybody looked at my editor, because they know I will try anything. My whole career is built around jumping from one genre to another because I like to have fun. And he called me up and said, epic fantasy, any thoughts, any ideas? And I said, yeah, of course, I've got ideas. He said, pitch me something. So I was actually at a restaurant. I wrote up a pitch that fast, like 15 minutes, sent it off to him.
Wow.
By the end of that day, we had a 2-book deal in place for me writing epic fantasy. And I never thought I would write epic fantasy in book length. I never realized how much fun I was going to have writing epic fantasy. A couple of little weird connections, though. My wife's grandfather, Oscar J. Friend, who was a pulp fiction writer and editor, was also the junior partner of the literary agency that represented Robert E. Howard and a lot of the writers who wrote Weird Tales. I was introduced to Weird Tales magazine and Conan and epic fantasy through another one of my childhood mentors, L. Sprague de Camp, who is the one that brought Conan back after all those, after Howard had committed suicide in the 30s. In the late 50s, early 60s, he brought Conan back and expanded on it by co-writing, with Lynn Carter and others. And without those books, I don't think there would be an epic fantasy genre today, because it just made everyone dive in there and just write epic fantasy. And that's my wife's grandfather, and turns out Sprague de Camp was kind of her unofficial uncle growing up. So there's just weird connections all over the place. And when her father died, a whole bunch of file boxes from that old literary agency were found in his attic. Mm-hmm. Among them were all the contracts and letters back and forth with these writers, and the original typescript manuscript of People of the Black Circle by Robert E. Howard. Whoa. I actually had the original typescript manuscript. Also, the original typescript manuscript of Cool Air by H.P. Lovecraft.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And one of my favorite writers growing up, Michael Moorcock, wound up giving us a cover quote, and he's notorious for never giving cover quotes.
Really?
The editor reached out to him, and he what he's known for, other than being a great writer, is if he dislikes a book, sending very harsh letters. And he sent me a letter that was so beautiful and so enthusiastic, and clearly he had read the entire book. Mm-hmm. And that quote is now on the cover of the book, and I couldn't be happier.
That's really awesome.
That's
Jenny,
some bragging
right
rights
to you. Next.
Well, can you, for those that haven't read the book, can you kind of give the back page synopsis, like what you know going in?
So it's important to know that the book is set 50,000 years from now. It's planet Earth.
Jenny, we were just talking about this before.
Everything from our world, our history, everything is gone. It completely collapsed down to barbarism. There were ice ages and everything else, and the only remnants of our world are trapped in ice in glaciers up in the north. So they don't remember us. However, it's still Earth. So there are still things we kind of recognize. The story opens with the Silver Empire, which has been in place for 1,000 years, and it's a seemingly very benign empire, the good guys. And in the process of building that empire, they crushed out all belief in magic, all practice of magic. Well, now the bad guy, the Witch King, has found a way to bring magic back. And he brings it back in such a dramatic way that in the opening pages, this is not a spoiler, he conquers the entire Silver Empire. Mm-hmm. The hero, Kagen, was palace guard, captain of palace guards. His only job, and he was oath-bound, which means his soul was tied up in his oath, was to protect the seedlings, the imperial children of this empire. And of course, they all get killed during the conquest. His gods turn their back on him. He's an outcast. He's a mess. And he spends a lot of time trying to drink himself to death while also killing as many of the bad guys as he can. So he's basically a murderous drunk for a while. Then he kind of gets his stuff together and decides to try to assassinate this Witch King who's taken over the empire. And at the same time, magic is returning to the world. And no one alive, except for people like the Witch King, have any experience with magic. It's all something historical anomaly to them. And now it's coming back and nobody knows what to do about it. There are also three pantheons of gods that's kind of critical to this. One is the harvest gods. They're the harvest gods of the Silver Empire, or the gods of the Silver Empire. Then there's the Hastur. He's the god of the bad guys, the Hakians. And that's Hastur, the King in Yellow from James Chambers, or Robert Chambers, rather, the classic, weird, influential novel, The King in Yellow. Mm-hmm. Hastur is also the half brother of Cthulhu, and that's the other pantheon of gods in the story. So I do bring some of, the Lovecraftian cosmology into the story, while at the same time building a new culture and a lot of other new elements that make it so much fun to write. It is not a story for people who are offended by harsh language, violence, and other things, because it's a very adult book.
Sure.
In terms of tone, it would probably fit somewhere between George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones, the politics and everything else, and Joe Abercrombie's The First Law series, which is, again, deals with politics and warring factions of ideologies.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you cleared that up, because before we were talking to you, we were talking to each other, and I said, one of the things I want to ask him is, where is this civilization in their development? Because they very clearly understand the idea of other planets, other galaxies, other stars, other solar systems, other dimensions, but also have nothing that we would consider modern medicine and fight with swords. So I was like, I'm very curious, and that answers a theory, because we even had the theory of like, are these people like in our future? And there's hints of that. I'm not going to spoil what they are, but there's hints of that in the book. And I was like, they're either in our future or something fell through from our world into theirs.
Yeah, it's definitely our future. And I had fun with laying some very subtle clues. There's a little more. The second book will be coming out in January, Son of the Poison Rose, which I've already finished writing.
I've already pre-ordered it.
Well, it's the longest book I've ever written. It's 207,000 words, so it's even longer than Kagen. It's 34,000 words longer than Kagen.
Wow.
But there's a little more. There are more hints there. In fact, there's one character from my Joe Ledger books that shows up in the second book. There's a trickster character named Nicodemus, who is basically he's like a Loki or a Coyote or one of the other trickster things. He shows up in this future world, and nothing else from any of my other books is going to be in there, but he's going to be in the second book, known as the Prince of Games. And that brings us a little more of a tie into the past.
Okay.
I was curious about that as well, just for the fact that I've dove so deep into like the Joe Ledger series, and you have that, I believe it was Kill Switch. Is that the one with there's the bit of the Cthulhu like mentality in there, and the different universes. And I'm like, could it be a bigger universe that all these consist within?
Yes, and there are also some very subtle references to what may have been a zombie apocalypse in the past.
And caught those.
Yeah, there'll be more of those, because there's zombies trapped in the glacial ice in the first book. There's more of that'll happen in the second book, and a lot more in the third book. Should we continue with the series, which my editor and I are hoping to do. So yeah.
I have to say that one of the coolest parts reading through this story is that it's a story based around Kagen, except you've got this good trait of adding in these secondary characters that you want to follow as much as you want to follow Kagen. Like Matt and I were talking about, and I'm going to butcher these names because I can barely speak English well, but these names some of them are a little tough, but is it Tuken? Is it Philia or Philia?
Tuken Philia, yeah.
Philia.
Those,
okay.
I could read a whole book just on those two.
And you may at some point, because I intend to explore their backstory, at least in short stories, individually and together. But I already have talked to Matt about a possible Tuken Philia book.
That's awesome news for me. So with that said, though, it's when you're developing these little like the side characters, that's what I think I learned the most about Kagen as it goes through, is the conversations that people have about him in scenes that he's not even in. When you approach the writing, how do you dive into pulling out those characteristics?
Well, for me, supporting characters are always important. They should never be there just for window dressing. They inform a lot more about the world, and that's true of the villains too, by the way. I make sure that I have complexity in the villains so that they are not just two-dimensional bad guys. They have a point of view. They have a reason. But with Tuken Philia, people like that, since Kagen is drunken out of his mind for quite a bit of the book, I didn't want him to be only known as that, because he's a character who was raised in the city in civilized, mannerly behavior, and that world is destroyed for him. And so the version we see isn't the true Kagan. From the very first line of the book, he's already going through turmoil. There's no point to get to know him before. So because of that, and because I don't want people to dislike him, I want them to understand him. Tuke and Philia, knowing him in different ways and at different times, are able to fill in the blanks. They see value in him that even Kagan at the time does not see in himself. Kagan it's a process for him to learn to find enough of himself, enough self-respect, enough optimism to be able to then be a force of opposition to the Witch King. We also learn about his family, Kagan's family, from different people. And that also informs us about the world. And there are some surprises built in along the way there. And I also set up a couple of characters, supporting characters, who will be more important in the second book, like his two brothers, Falker and Jecklin. If you can imagine the Weasley twins from Harry Potter grown up and to become warriors, that's the base. They're lighthearted, they're silly, but they're also really good at fighting, and they're adventurers, and they'll be playing into the story. But supporting characters are as important to the story as Kagan is for me. It's not just Kagan's story, but so there are a lot of people circulating in orbits around Kagan. You have Mother Frey, who was actually the first character from the Kagan world I ever wrote about. I did a short story about her. It's actually just come out in Lightspeed magazine, which is a science fiction fantasy webzine. The story with her, and also with a character Miri, their a backstory with them came out in the story in Lightspeed today, I think, or yesterday.
I'm glad you mentioned Miri, because reading through the book, every time it would jump from the Kagan's point of view storyline to Miri and is it Rissa? It felt like two different worlds, but they were so connected that they blend really seamlessly together. And the way the story is written is you're following Rissa and kind of seeing her point of view, but Miri was such a powerhouse in it. As I read it, I was like, I wanted to continue with them. I wanted to keep going. What are their backstories?
Yeah, and you get some of Miri's backstory in that story, The Hammer of God, which is her and Mother Frey. Rissa is a new character for this story, for this novel, but I am far from done with her.
That's good.
And Miri, there's a lot more. Their story as the series goes on. Rissa is on the path to becoming one of the most powerful people in the world. Yeah, and okay. For those who have read the book and know who her patron is, her patron god is, you understand why she may be become very powerful. But she's very, very powerful character, and Miri has also her own unique arc to play. And it was fun building that because I wanted their storyline to be tonally different than the rest of the book. Just as when I'm writing about the Witch King, Lord Nesper and Lady Kestrel, I wanted their story to be tonally different. And that's fun for me as a writer, to be able to use shifts in tone for different subplots to allow each subplot to have its own strength and reality, while still being part of the fabric of the book. And that was a deliberate choice, and it was really fun to play with that, to weave those elements in together to make that. And there's also some scenes, some chapters where it's just one scene with certain characters, incidental scenes that inform us about the world. And it's going to sound weird, but the reason I do this is because of James Bond. I will explain. I always hated in James Bond books or movies where he never met the villain until the very end, and then the villain sits him down over a nice dinner and explains everything about their motivations and worldview and so on, which would never happen in a real world with spies and spec ops and so on. So even in my Joe Ledger books, I would switch between the first person point of view of Joe Ledger to a third person point of view of the backstory of the villain, so we understand why they're doing what they're doing. Because people don't wake up and decide, hey, I'm evil. Right. There's a pathway and there's a worldview that allows them to justify what they do. So I wanted to be able to use that same concept to be able to inform about other characters and to let incidental characters, people who may show up for a single chapter, to inform us about an aspect of the world that Kagan may never see, but we should know to understand the world. Kagan is somewhat of an unreliable narrator in his own story in this first book because he's so emotionally distraught. So I needed to build the world for the reader so that they understood it with as much complexity as possible without having to have these constant info dumps via Kagan.
Sure. Speaking of world building, you've created, there's a map in the book like there are in all good fantasy books, I feel like. But and so you've got all these countries with different names, and in the continent they appear to be on appears to be quite large and everything. And when you sit down to do an epic fantasy and you're essentially creating a world and you come up with names nobody has and everything like that, do you think to yourself that each country maybe has rules for how you name things, or are these names that you're just coming up with because you like how they sound? Because like you said, you're like, world building, I guess. So you're kind of coming up with how everything functions in this new world no one's ever been familiar with before.
Yeah, it's a bit of both. And most countries have a little bit of a corollary to a real world country, either now or in the past, to kind of help you get a sense of it when you're doing it. Like there's a country on the western side or the eastern side of the map, which we don't really deal with much in this book, called Inaki. Well, to me, it's Japan. Okay. And so Samud is basically one of the Arabian states from the old Barbary days. So it allows me to get a glimpse of the culture, and give them a cultural identity without borrowing too heavily on something, but just enough so that when I visualize that country, because it's in some way tied to a real place, it's easier for me to think of everything from the mode of dress to the way of speaking to the religion to even the way they dress. All of that will factor in when I create those characters. Some of the country names, though, I have no idea where they came from. I really don't.
Well, that happens.
Yeah, and some are deliberate and will play into future histories, so to speak, of the story.
Okay.
I think that was one of my favorite parts, which I don't think this is a spoiler, but when Mary is trying to teach Rissa how to speak the language. Every time I've ever tried, I am the worst when it comes to languages and names. And her response on trying to learn it, I'm like, I relate with you, girl. I relate with you. So like, how do you go about like pulling those words together? Because I actually, in reading too, I thought like there might be some hidden curse words in a few of those.
Actually, no. And I would like to take all the credit for that language, but it's not. It's the language of Relaya, the language of Cthulhu. There is actually a utility online that is a translator from English to that language.
Wow.
So
okay.
everything that is said is actually run through that translator and then put in the book. So if you use that translator to reverse it, you'll see what everything actually says in English. Some of which I want the reader to know, and some of which isn't important for the reader to know. The language is bizarrely difficult to pronounce. And my audiobook reader, Ray Porter, who just finished recording the book, I think yesterday, is one of the few people who is known as an audiobook reader to be able to correctly pronounce that language because it's appeared in other works before. And when I first used it in one of my stories, I did it to try to mess with Ray. I always try to mess with Ray and throw something at him he can't do. Every time I do that, he wins. I'll give you an example. In one book, Deadlands, Ghostwalkers, based on the Deadlands role-playing game, I had a character speaking Lakota Sioux, and I had contacted the Lakota Tribal Council to get accurate translations of things into Lakota Sioux. Turns out Ray had done a play where he had to play a Native American and learned Lakota Sioux.
Oh, wow.
And it's like that. Every time I come up with something, I think this is going to really screw him. He knocks it out of the park. So when he saw how much of that language is in the book, he did send me an email that let's just say it's unprintable, and then ended with something along the lines of, "You owe me a really good bottle of scotch." So,
oh wow,
you'll get one.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So Kagan himself is kind of like you said, he's kind of like a drunk mess for most of the book. And one of the things you mentioned, he turns his gods turn his back on him and everything. And I towards the end of the book, there's hints that the gods are real and throughout the book. But I was just kind of wondering, just from your point of view, are these religions based on like these things are happening to these people and that's part of the magic in the world? Maybe this is a spoiler. I don't know. Maybe I'm asking you about a spoiler question, or is this like something Kagan and everybody else is kind of not necessarily really experiencing? Because I'm always curious with things like that, because it seems up for interpretation, but maybe that was just me.
A couple people have had that thought, and it doesn't really matter that much early on in the series. However, the gods are real, but how much they're actually influencing the actions of people is something that we will learn. The people of the Silver Empire who believed in the harvest gods think that those gods were much more active, and they have rude awakening when those gods do nothing to protect them when they're invaded. And it isn't even their gods who go to war with the god Hastur from Hakia later in the book. So it calls into question how much any of the gods really care about us or involve themselves in what we do. And that's fun. Now, of course, a lot of what's called miracle in religion is another word for magic, raising the dead, healing. So now that magic is returning to the world, the question is, does that mean the gods become more powerful? Were they limited before by the removal of magic? And that's a question that will be explored as the series goes on, because now that magic is coming back, everything that relies on some sort of magic is going to become more powerful.
That was the other twist I liked pretty early on in the book. Like you said, you mentioned it at, the Witch King conquers everybody else, and you very quickly find out, like you said, that magic has been outlawed all over the world because of one empire. And I like the, you mentioned talking about political. I like the ideas, playing with the ideas of just because you're raised thinking you're the good guy doesn't necessarily mean that everything that your ancestors always did was wonderful, and maybe now you have to come to terms with that. That's a nice theme I enjoyed in the book. It
is, and it's I'm a somewhat objective student of history, where I look at the old saying that history is written by the victors. Well, that's often true, and the Western Europeans wrote a lot of the history that we know of, but when you go to the other side and look at their version of history, it's a completely different story. And just because they lost doesn't mean they were wrong. Just because they won doesn't mean they were right. So that's one of the reasons I included a character who is in fact a historian who is a self-proclaimed propagandist, writes the history that serves who's paying him. And there have been a lot of those in actual history.
Oh, wow.
It was cool too, the consequences that everything had. Like magic had consequences, but banning magic had consequences. When you write, how do you find that balance so it directs the readers to who you want the heroes to be?
Well, I mean, Kagan is the default hero because we see how much is taken away from him personally as well as professionally in the beginning. And that, we understand why he goes through the emotional trauma, and that bonds us to him. The Witch King, we don't find out about his viewpoints until much later, until we've already formed an opinion about him as the bad guy. And then we see he might actually have a really compelling argument for why he did what he did. So it's really the point at which you introduce people to certain characters helps the bonding process with that character. And I want them to bond with Kagan and later with Philiatuk and Frey. They're the ones that we want to bond with. Rissa and Miri, I leave it uncertain as to, is this a good thing or a bad thing? What's going on in that plot line? With the Witch King, he's the bad guy, but he's not pure evil, and also, there is a surprise as to his identity. That is his motivations are explored really deeply in the next book, which
Good.
explains a lot of what happened during the coronation. And you
That's
guys
really
don't even know what that means yet.
No, not yet. No, and I'm looking forward to finding that out. One thing I will say, just in general, is I'm not a big fantasy reader, but I have a friend that reads lots and lots of fantasy, and he's in discussions with other fantasy readers and whatnot. And one thing he was mentioning recently, actually while I was in the middle of reading Kagen the Damned, was he's now in a group of people that are trying to reinvigorate the encourage the reinvigoration of the fantasy genre, because they find a lot of fantasy being written is oddly regressive and oddly sticks to a lot of old, outdated tropes. And one of the things I said to him is, I said, "Oh, I have got a book you are gonna want to buy. I'm right in the middle of this book, Kagen the Damned. Tell all your friends about it, because this is what I would consider reinvigorated fantasy. You know, your Silver Empire is run by women. You have, Philia and Risa and Miri and Mother Frey, who are all very strong, very forward-thinking women. You have some I don't want to spoil it necessarily. I'll say you have a queer relationship in there, so that nobody knows, what kind of relationship so I don't spoil that, but there is a queer relationship in there. And I just found that, for people like my friend who are now in this group trying to say, let's encourage authors writing, more modern, up-to-date fantasy, that this was really a book that I think is going to help the genre in the way that they feel it needs helping.
From your lips to Cthulhu's ears. But it's interesting. Some of the elements there, like the strong female characters, that speaks a little bit to my own background. I taught women's self-defense for 35 years. I'm martial arts, retired martial arts master, and I've taught women's self-defense. I know how strong women can be. I had 4 older sisters. I know how brutal they can be to a younger brother. And also, just looking at history, there have been powerful warrior queens. There, Boadicea and others. Yes, they may have come to bad ends, but they were powerful. There have been women rulers, Cleopatra. So it's not like I'm inventing anything new, but It's been so crowded out of a very male-centric genre. I mean, much as I like Lord of the Rings, there's like a handful of female characters, and even Arwen doesn't have much to do in the series. They gave her more to do in the movies than they did in the actual books. And I don't think there was a female character in The Hobbit, in the original Hobbit novel.
Nope.
So I wanted to include that. As far as queer characters go, I mean, being gay is not something that was invented in the 20th century.
Nope.
You can go all the way. Ancient Greece, read the history of ancient Greece, it's very common, and it was not, you weren't chastised for it. It was part of the human experience back then. I don't make it a weird thing here. It's a thing.
No, yeah, it's just a thing, right?
And it's not like, and I'm sure there's going to be the inevitable person out there who's going to say, "Oh, this guy's woke" and all that nonsense. It's not. It's just looking at humanity for what it actually is, and then writing about that. And much as I love Tolkien, that even in dialogue, the characters tend to speak in like proclamations. Lord Denethor is always speaking as if that sentence needs to be remembered by generations to come. People just talk,
Yeah.
And I wanted the dialogue to be more representational of just average people. George R. R. Martin did that really well, in his books. People spoke like human beings. The show Spartacus and the other one, Rome, also did the same thing, where they didn't speak like characters from a biblical novel. They spoke like human beings. And that invites, in fact, the writer to give more dimension to those characters, to make them not historical figures, but people who lived in a different era of history. And I attempt to do that with Kagan. I wanted them to be real people.
It helps too with the story develop, in my opinion, because it doesn't feel like it's thrown in, like having a queer couple in a story. If it's forced, like I'm putting this in because it's the sign of the times. It doesn't feel like that, because the characters and the environments and the island people in the book, there's all a reason to be behind it. It's not forced. And I think that's where a lot of conversations get lost is when it's forced versus when it's natural, and it flows really well.
Thank you.
With that going on, the big thing I want to talk about, and this is what I've always struggled with fantasy, is like, I love the world building of fantasy, but it feels like it's just a lot of like fight after fight after fight, and it's all the same fight. What I loved about this is that every fight felt different. You had fights where Tuke and Kagen are fighting together. You have solo fights. You have big magical fights. And then the whole idea of some of the classes of people and whether they can carry swords or not carry swords, and the daggers. How, when you approach it, and I know just from your other writing, you are really good at writing fights. How did you make that map to go forward? Because it flows really well, and without having guns, missiles, and all the modern technology, it's an interesting take.
Well, my background has a lot to do with it. You know, I've been doing jujitsu and kenjutsu, which is Japanese swordplay, for 58 years. I was a former bodyguard for 4 years. I was a bouncer for years. I was competitive in a lot of different, you know, combat martial arts, but also I taught martial arts and self-defense from everyone from, you know, groups of children, groups of women, the physically impaired, to SWAT teams and special ops guys. I'm an expert in combat, not in performance martial arts, not word breaking, but in combat. That's my thing. And I also teach writing workshops and writing fight scenes, and I'm the guy that a lot of my writer friends consult on that. The reason I approach that in the books, I don't want any fight scene to ever be impossible. Even if Kagen is fighting, like I did a short story where Kagen is fighting a werewolf. It'll be out, you know, they'll actually be giving it out free between the release of the 2 books. That has to have a logic to it. There has to be an internal logic, a philosophy of combat within it. And I want each fight scene to be unique, because every fight is. I've been in a lot of fights. I've actually been shot at, stabbed, chopped with a meat cleaver, you know. Yeah, that's no fun. Not as much fun as it sounds.
Let's not repeat that.
Been in a lot of fights, and I know what they're like. I know how quickly they go. I know how brutal they are. And I wanted to represent the reality of what a fight is. But at the same time, I also wanted to bring something in that I haven't seen that much. Every one of these things, you know, is too much of a sword. Everybody has a sword. Well, the thing is, not everyone has swords. There are whole cultures where a sword is such an expensive piece of artillery or of machinery that only a few people, the knights, have it. The average soldier following a knight doesn't have a sword. He has a pike, he has daggers, he has maces and clubs. You know, they don't focus enough on how they fight. And also, what happens if your sword breaks? I mean, the whole art of jujitsu was developed by the samurai for use when, for whatever reason, they didn't have their sword and they're on the battlefield against other samurai. You got to figure something out. And also, as a fighter myself, I'm what's called an in-fighter. I like fighting close up, which is unusual for a guy my size. Usually, I'm 6'4". I'm really big. Usually, big guys tend to fight at a distance. They use their length of arm to keep the opponent at bay, and they rely on strength rather than speed. Well, my instructor taught all the big guys in class to be fast and to fight close, which the other guy will never expect from a big man. And as a result, I won the fights I was in. I wanted Kagen to be a close-in fighter, so I didn't give him a sword. I gave him his mother's daggers. His mother was the greatest fighter of the age. And now Kagen has her daggers, and he is on the way to becoming the greatest fighter of the age. There's actually, I know it's the next book. I just finished writing it, so I'm so long. There is a fight scene in the next book that establishes that Kagen is the baddest son of a bitch out there.
Awesome.
When he really reclaims his own personal power and he has a fight, my editor and a whole bunch of other people who have read the book early, you know, email me like, what the? I've never seen it like that. I'm like, yeah, you haven't, you know. And it's fun to do that because it isn't cliche. I loathe cliche. If something is an accepted trope, that means that it should, by its definition, be elastic. So if I see something that's cliche, like a standard fight scene or duel, whatever, or a setup like a trope. I want to go in there. I think it's my job to go in there and find a way to make that fresh and new. I did that with my zombie books and, with my Spec Ops thriller series. And I feel that I brought that game to this book where it isn't what you'd expect, but it makes sense.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I'll say, like, you mentioned tropes. One of the things with, it was called sword and sorcery, right? Like there's a reason that what you got here, and I think the best way I would review this for other people would be to say, it is, I call it Shades of the Dark Tower, where you have got, you've got your sorcery and your magic, you've got swords, you've got other dimensions, and you have got a little bit of sci-fi in there as well, because they know, and a little bit of modern world, because I think the thing I was most fascinated about was the fact that these people know astronomy. They know there's other planets. They know there's other stars. They're not,
as the Greeks did, by the way.
Right, as the Greeks did as well. And they're not, when you think of, there's the trope that fantasy is like this magic land that is forever stuck in medieval times. And that's what I appreciated most about Kagen the Damned, is you went, well, kinda, but not really. And you pushed back against that a little bit.
And had a hell of a lot of fun doing that too. And this is not Narnia.
No. Or Middle Earth or anything.
Yeah, it's not Middle Earth. It's funny because at one point I tried to get permission from the estate of the Tolkien estate to do an anthology of stories about the Rangers, because that would have been gritty combat, espionage, and all sorts of things. Unfortunately, the estate didn't want anyone else to write a Tolkien story, but I think that would have been probably closer to what we did with Kagan, where it's not the hobbits, it's not the elves and dwarves, it's a bunch of guys on horseback trying to find out what's going on and protect people very quietly but very effectively. And it would have been darker, but unfortunately that didn't happen. So I'm doing this instead.
Yes. Well, I have other questions.
I got plenty of time.
I was gonna say, but the more I think about them, the more I'm trying to. I don't want to spoil anything for anybody. Jenny, I'm gonna see if you've got anything else to do.
Well, that's the hardest part, because some of the biggest things that I take away would be complete spoilers.
Sure. A
lot of it, though, and I'm hoping this isn't a spoiler, but the way you describe some of the characters, especially on, is it Tuliyama? How do you, the island name where Miriam?
Tol Yamath.
Okay.
The citizens on that island and the captains of the ships and such, the way that they're described feels otherworldly. But I'm curious if that has to do with magic, or it has to do with simple evolution, because it's been, what'd you say, 50,000 years or so, or if it has to do with the gods. Like, why
a bit of all that. It's
not.
It's a nod to a degree to some of Lovecraft stories, like Dagon, like Shadow over Innsmouth. The inner breeding between humans and the fish people, the sea people. There's a bit of that, and that will actually play out, because we also have the religion of Dagon, which is another one of those sea god pantheons. So there is a bit of that, but it's not one where the people are forced into something. This is who they have become through choice. They're embracing that. They want to be more part of the sea than the normal person could possibly be. So they stop being normal. They embraced that change, and any more would be a spoiler for a future book, but they are not entirely human anymore. Some are, and those are the ones who go out into the rest of the world, like Miri. Miri looks entirely human. Is not, just looks it. She can pass for human. And that makes it fun. And all of the islands in the Kagan world, the word for island is Tull. So everything's Tull and then something else. Tull Yamath is the island that is closest to, or that is populated by people who have embraced this other worldliness. or rather inner worldliness, really, as their path forward to being the best they can be. And I love the people of Tell-Yamath, actually. I really enjoyed building.
They're really
culture.
cool people. Yeah.
And again, much more to come.
Well,
All right.
even with that though, like they, you did a great job of explaining them with that, that they're not monsters, but then you have other characters that come throughout the series or throughout the book that are our classic monsters.
Yeah.
And when I got to parts with certain characters, I'm like, wait a minute, time out. I'm like, are we throwing in classic monsters in with the old gods and everything? It feels like such a smorgasbord of stuff that actually is following trails that make sense. Did you game plan it of, I want to put you said he's going to fight a werewolf in another book. How did you come into what you want to add and what you don't?
Well, there's some backstory to that. Before I wrote my first novel, which was published in 2006, I wrote nonfiction books on the folklore of supernatural monsters, belief systems around the world throughout history. I've written a total of 5 or 6 of them, I forget. And I love the folkloric versions of monsters because they are different. Like a folkloric vampire, you can never find a vampire anywhere in folklore who is afraid of a cross, killed by sunlight, killed by a stake through the heart. That's not in folklore. That's all in fiction that has been written about these monsters. Even Dracula walked around during the day, and people think Dracula was killed by a stake through the heart. He was stabbed with a knife, 2 knives, a kukri knife and a Bowie knife. That's how he dies at the end of the book. Everyone forgets that. He was, and he walked around during the daylight. He was just less powerful during the day. So I wanted to use the folkloric monsters. And if these creatures exist in our world and have existed for these thousands of years, and they have special powers, it is unlikely they would be eliminated by catastrophic earth changes. Some of them would survive. So we have a vampire in the story. We have a dark version of fairy folk in the story. Mm-hmm. We will have a werewolf, a clan of werewolves in a short story, and other things as well. And that's a lot of fun. I have a character in the story that's actually constructed based on 3 different poems. The Lady of Shalott by Alfred Lord Tennyson, John Keats' La Belle Dame Sans Merci, and the Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser. There's a character who embodies elements of all 3 of those characters. And I'm not going to say who it is or where in Canada, where you guys probably know by now. If the fairy folk, and by the way, in folklore, the fairy folk, not nice, not at all nice. If the fairy folk were there, there is a belief. My grandmother told me about this. She was, if you can imagine Luna Lovegood as an old lady, that was my grandmother. She believed in everything. So she believed that the reason that there aren't fairies active now is because they hate what's happened to their world. So they went to another version of the world. They went through a doorway, a veil to another version of the world. In the Kagen stories, the fairy folk and others left this world. And then when magic was crushed out, they couldn't get back. Well, now those doorways are open. So we're going to see the return of some of our own folkloric monsters in this world because they haven't been destroyed. They've just been gone, absent.
Okay.
And that is fun for me to do.
Yeah, I bet. I can imagine. Wow. All right.
Yeah. Well, I have a question though about the environment.
Sure.
So the tower he climbs in the book really reminds me of that classic kind of Save the Princess type storyline. You've got to, Rapunzel even, like it's got that feel to it. But it feels like a completely different world than where Mary and Reese are at, which is more like almost like tiki, like very island oriented versus the city. When I was reading it, a part that I liked is there were scenes where everything was covered with mist, or it seemed very foggy, hazy, lightning strike type stuff. Then in other scenes, you can hear and see the ocean. You can see down each street where then fires on another street. When you're weaving your characters through the different areas, how do you set that tone, whether it, basically, is it going to rain? Is it going to be sunny? And is it based off of the emotions of the scene?
And some of it's based off the emotions of the scene. And sometimes the emotions of the scene are based off how I started building the weather and the environment of that scene. So if I decide it's a rainy day, it's going to change the way in which I write the scene. So it's a little bit of both. And also I'm really into, I'm an artist as well as a writer, not a professional artist, but an artist enough that I visualize a lot of stuff. And also I'm a huge movie and film buff. I've been on the set. I was on the set of my own TV show, V Wars, was on the set of that. So I saw how they constructed the scenes and so on. I lay out my stories as a film or a TV show. I want to see it. I want to see what you can see from this point. I want to know what you can't see from that point, because that can maybe add an element of mystery. When Kagen is going through the town, and when Rissa and Miri are going through Argentium when it's burning, they're seeing different things. They're in different parts of the town. They have different levels of perception, and also they're going in different places. So it's even the way in which fire and light, mist and everything else, that will all change depending on what part of town they're in. The closer they get to the seafront, the more mist is going to be. That's the nature of oceans. They're higher humidity. Some writers forget the five senses and they forget the weather. I want to know the weather report for any chapter I'm going to write. Most of the book takes place in Argonne and Valicourt, which is basically France.
Okay.
It's the climate of France. So when they're up in Valicourt, they're in essentially the French wine country. You have rain, we have a lot of it. It's a little dry. It's a little more arid, but it is farmland. So that will inform the way in which I write those types of scenes. What's the climate of that region? When they go up to Nelfidia in the next book, which is basically Siberia, it's cold, and Kagen has no experience with that. He's a city boy from the South. So the cold becomes as much of a threat to him as anything else. There's a scene in the second book where he's in a blizzard. He's never been in a blizzard before. And weird stuff is happening in that blizzard. If I just had him riding through the woods on a cold day, there's no drama there. I want to add that drama to it. Mm-hmm. So you really do have to think of how it looks on screen, or how it would feel to be in that moment, and that helps you build the atmosphere, the landscape, and everything else with a greater degree of realism than if it's just a convenient place for them to stand and stab each other with swords.
Sure. Now, one thing I always have loved is about everything you've written is you have a very good knack of series. You write plenty of series, and you know how to leave a book where it's like, this one was very satisfying. It was a complete story, but boy, oh boy, can I not wait to find out what comes next. You mentioned that, you have Son of the Poison Rose, which is coming out next year, and potentially a third book. When you come up with a series, do you have the idea, like for Kagan's story, for example, would the second book be an end point if there wasn't going to be a third book, or are you like, no, there better be a third book because I need to write more of this story?
Yeah, the second book has a couple of different cliffhangers.
Okay.
I mean, there is a satisfying resolution. Each book has its own arc. There's kind of I hate to call it a quest, but there's a thing Kagen needs to do in the second book, and that gets done. Mm-hmm. Not the way he expected, but it gets done. And now that means this now has to happen, and that will be the third book. I've outlined, it's funny, I outlined it two different ways. I outlined this as a continual series where I can continue going each book, kind of like Game of Thrones, where each book continues building. Mm-hmm. But I also outlined a version where it could end at a trilogy if the publisher wants that. I even gave them some options of, because we just pitched the next couple of books of this is the next book, and if we want to go into each successive book being a self-contained adventure, these are what the self-contained adventures would be. But if we want it to be a continuing series, this is how those self-contained adventures overlap with the longer game plan that I have.
Okay.
You know, figure Son of the Poison Rose was my 45th novel written since 2006. So I've learned a lot about the structure of novels and about writing series. And I tend to read books that are in series rather than standalones. I like the depth of character development you get in series. That's why I like TV more than film. I like the character development opportunities that are in even a 10 episode series rather than a 2-hour movie. That's why I'm glad The Witcher was not done as a movie, because there's so many, the characters are so nicely developed that by watching the show, you care about every character, where if it was in a movie, you'd just be caring about 2 or 3. And I want to do that same sort of thing with Katie. So, and I'll also be writing a lot of short stories along the way too, to fill it in and have some fun with it.
You sort of answered my other question there as well, which there's 2 types of authors. I have a friend that writes, and I dabble a little bit in writing, and we call them, there's planners and there's people that do seat of the pants, where how much and obviously when right, and yeah, and when you're obviously doing a series and creating a world like the world that you created here with Kagen the Damned, how much prep work goes into that? How much sitting and going, okay, here is where, how much time goes into prepping that and outlining and taking notes of, this is what I want this world to look like?
Well, I'm very much a plotter. In fact, when I was writing Kagen, not only did I have an outline, but after I wrote the first few chapters until the point where he gets out of the city of Argentium, I then jumped forward and wrote the ending, the whole scene in the palace during the coronation.
Okay.
So I actually wanted to know exactly how the book was going to end. Even though I wrote out the plot, writing the story has a more organic thing than writing a plot. A plot's like a trellis on which you'll grow roses. You don't know how those roses are going to look, but you know the basic shape of it because of the trellis. I wanted to know how it was going to end. And I have outlines, complete outlines for the 3rd book. And I know exactly how it's going. I've even written some scenes for that 3rd book that pick up storylines from the previous books. So the reason I wrote those scenes, I want to keep the same tone of those scenes. That said, in the writing, there are always things that will come up that will require changes. Characters become much more interesting or even less interesting. There's a character I completely cut out of the 1st book because no matter how I wrote him, he's just there to deliver lines. And I didn't want a character who's just there to deliver lines. So I cut him out and I gave the most important lines to other characters. And there are characters that in plot weren't as crucial. Like Took was only in one scene in the original story.
Wow.
And when I started writing it, especially when I jumped forward to write the ending, I realized that Kagen needs his crew. And Philia, as powerful as she is not enough. So I needed to bring Took back. And then I went back and replotted the whole book and realized this is one of my favorite characters. Plus, he's also the funniest character in the series.
Yeah.
My editor is already using some of his by the fairy balls of the whatever God.
Very colorful curses he comes up with. His proclamations are very entertaining.
Yeah, he's a fun character to write, and like a lot of the supporting characters I put in my books, he's not one note. He has his own depth and complexity, has his own issues. Philia is a lot of fun to write because she's the adult in the room every time, and Kagen and Duke aren't always the adults in the room.
Right.
So good.
Oh no, I was gonna say that's right. They're far from ever being that, as far as I can tell. Yeah.
That's what makes them so endearing, and that's what makes her, like, I wouldn't say relatable, but you kind of get behind her because at least if she's steering the ship, the other 2 clowns might make it.
I love the characters. Mother Frey is one we haven't really talked much about, but I love that character. She is to give you an idea of the origin of this, when I first wrote the first Mother Frey story, it was actually for an anthology of Sherlock Holmes stories that were atypical, whereas it was a very hyper aware and hyper intelligent person and an apprentice who was learning the skills. But in the anthology, they could be anything except white males. So I wanted to do, in a fantasy world, an older woman, younger woman, partnership, and love the character. And it was largely because of wanting to write more about her that I came up with a plot for Kagen than I did. She's fun to write, and she has a lot of story to tell. And
I was gonna say I didn't touch on her too much because she's interesting and she's a good character, but in this particular book, she's not featured quite as much yet. I imagine there's more from her coming, but she very much is like the political, like Took is out there with Kagen because Mother Frey wants to make sure that Kagen gets back because he's her plan A for saving the Empire and whatnot. So,
and she has unusual connections to the Vale family, to Kagan's family that we'll explore later on. And, she gets to meet Falker and Jacqueline, and they become part of the story in the second book. So she is a master manipulator. She's just very quiet about it. But I love the character, and it was fun putting her in. And I also love the dream sequences, which a lot of people are split on whether they like dream sequences or not. Mm-hmm. But Kagan's dream sequences, which he has a lot of in the story, are very crucial to understanding the overall story. Yes. And there are very carefully laid hints in there about things that will come in the first book and in the rest of the series. And his relationship with his brother Harapath was so much fun to write. Harapath is a really fun character. He's cold, manipulative, but Kagan loves him. He's the older brother he loves the most. So I had some fun with that too.
When you're writing, like in the fantasy genre, I lean towards more of the graphic novel and the live action, so TV, movies, and such. I personally haven't dove deep into the books, but I can tell you a lot about the graphic novels and the television and movies. When writing this, it opened that world to me where it read like a great novel and all that. Do you ever envision it taking that next step into another format, like a movie or a comic book? Or
it's funny because my audiobook reader, who is an actor, is giving me casting suggestions all while recording it. And in fact, I can't tell you who, but he's doing a Zack Snyder film right now, my audiobook reader, and there's an actor he's working with. He thinks it'd be great for Kagan. So I just sent a copy of the book to that guy. But I have a film agent with Dana Spector at CAA, who is, now that the book is actually in print, she's going to be shopping it for a potential TV series.
Fantasy's pretty big in live action right now with, Game of Thrones ended, and then the Game of Thrones spinoff is coming, and the Lord of the Rings TV series and the Witcher series and whatnot.
Wheel of Time.
Wheel of Time as well, yes. Fantasy is very, very big in TV right now, and it's a good place for it, actually. Just for all the things you were saying, fantasy tends to be, big and epic and full of character development, and TV allows for that. So this would be very, and you have a very visually striking writing style. So when you're reading through, you can envision what all of this looks like, especially like Jenny was saying earlier, the fight scenes and whatnot. So.
Well, thank you. In fact, I also at some point will be, once the book is out and getting some fan feedback, probably pitching it as a comic book or a graphic novel as well.
Oh, that'd be really cool.
And probably not an adaptation of the book, but standalone adventures with Kagan.
That would be really cool.
Yeah, that would be fun. Yeah. And maybe some stuff with the Poison Rose as well.
Oh, yeah. I'd like to see, that's the thing is, now that you've created this whole world, it's like, well, now I have about, and I, that's the other thing I said, I can't talk about them while we're recording, just because there's like, now there's about 150 things at least that I want to know more about, both before this story takes place and after this story takes place.
I'm so glad you touched on that. I'm like, this has prequels written all over it.
Yeah.
Like,
that makes, as a writer, that makes me so happy to hear. Yeah.
Well, I want to know what happened when they took over. I want to know when the Silver Empire like became, and how it became, and what political maneuvers had to happen to make that happen.
Yep.
If the series is successful, my writing a prequel, at least a prequel novel, if not a prequel series, is almost, certain, because I want to tell the story of the Silver Empire and what happened to the Blue Empire, which was before them. Why did we fall? And also I want to tell the story of his mother's lineage, because she is descendant of Lady Bellifer, the Silver Thorn, who was the most powerful in all of the history, the most powerful warrior ever.
Wow.
Why? What made her so powerful? And why was she so adamant to crush Hakia and their magic?
I was gonna say, I want to know all about Hakia. I want to, all that stuff.
I want to tell those stories too. So I'm really hoping the series does well. You never know with a new book,
Sure.
But the reviews we got are great. I mean, we got really strong support from Michael Moorcock, Robin Hobb, which Shauna McGuire, James Rollins, Kevin Anderson. So that was really encouraging. And the people who have read it so far all seem to dig it, which, when you're writing something that's out of your normal wheelhouse, you never know how people are going to take it. Sure, I know I enjoyed the hell out of it, but I want to keep writing more and more and more in this series.
Wow.
The artist in me, though, kind of leans to that ideology that if you love what you do, it's going to come through, and you can see the care that you've taken with Kagan as it goes through the story, as well with all that world building we talked about. What I'm most excited for, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I loved most about it was primarily fantasy, but it could totally be sold as a horror novel. Like, it had the monster mentality and such like that. And bringing those two together where they blend, where if you're trying to explain the book, I don't know if I can explain it so much to somebody, because depending on who I talk to, I'm like, it's a great freaking monster book. Like, you're going to love it. Or I might go, it's the best fantasy. It's a cool way of like teetering the line.
It was fun to do. I'm a horror guy. I broke into the fiction as a horror writer, and I love horror. My favorite, for example, my favorite science fiction genre is science fiction horror. Event Horizon, Life Force, Aliens, that sort of stuff. I love the clash of genres. I don't like to sit directly in just one genre, because I don't feel that allows me to have as much creative freedom as I want. Even in my Spec Ops thriller series, the Joe Ledger series, there's horror in that.
Yep.
He goes up against monsters of all kinds, and yet it's still grounded in real world. The characters are still like, are you shitting me? Vampires? So there's still that moment where they realize they're in a horror story and they're not prepared for it, but they're so aware of it. It's fun to do. But I love horror. I love creepy. I love setting moods. I love surprising the reader. And we have many more monsters coming up in this series.
Good deal.
And also some little Easter eggs there for folks who are really well read in a variety of things, including Lovecraftian stuff. There are some Easter eggs there, like the short story, The Color Out of Space. There's a whole section in Kagan that deals with a color that is impossible to describe, and it's so impossible, it kind of drives you buggy. Well, that's my nod to H.P. Lovecraft, and some readers will catch it, some won't. But the task, the challenge, I guess, is to make sure that when you write something like that, if you don't know the reference, it doesn't matter to reading the story.
Right.
Which just adds another little layer to it.
Yep. That's awesome. Well, I know I don't have anything left to ask that wouldn't be going into giving things away for people. So, Jenny, I don't know if you do or not, but if you don't, then we'll have Jonathan plug the book as much as possible, and we'll plug the book as much as possible. And yeah.
And this has been a really fun conversation. You guys ask great questions. This is my favorite interview I've done so far for Kagen. So, really
thank you. Wow, that means a lot.
Yeah.
And after we're done recording, if you have a couple questions, I will answer them.
Okay, good, because I do. Yeah. So Jonathan, tell everybody when Kagen the Damned comes out. We're gonna. Oh, we were gonna ask you if we should put this out before or after the book comes out, but I guess it doesn't. But either way, tell them when it comes out and everything, well, so that
Kagen debuts in hardcover, trade paperback, ebook, and audio, read by Ray Porter, May 10th, and I'll be actually in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, launching it. I'm flying back to Pennsylvania to launch it. I'll be doing a bunch of signings in California. And as I go doing conventions for the rest of the year in different parts of the country, I'll be really, pimping Kagen, because it's my big book this year. And I'm so in love with this book. I've never, a lot of writers always say that their latest book is their favorite. I have never had as much fun writing a book as I did Kagen. I loved every part of it. The only part I didn't like was the fact that I reached the end and I'm like, ooh, but then my editor wanted me to jump right into the next book. So I'm like, all right,
Perfect. And all those dates where all the so you obviously you're all over social media. You have your own website. Tell everybody where they can find you online so they can find those dates and see you out in the world and talk to you about Kagen in person.
Sure. Well, the list of appearances are actually going up on my website later this week. My assistant's been on vacation, and then I'll go up my website. It'll also be on my Facebook, both Facebook pages, Twitter and Instagram. So I'll be putting all that stuff up this week, and I will be, talking about Kagen and having a lot of fun with it. I'll be appear at a bunch of Comic-Cons around the country this year, including San Diego Comic-Con, Tampa Bay Comic-Con, Baltimore Comic-Con, and FanX in Salt Lake City. So I'll be bouncing all over the country, and with this book and having a whole bunch of fun with it. So if you see a big hairy guy with Hawaiian shirts grinning, that'll be me, because Kagen's out May 10th.
Awesome.
And then the second book comes out January 10th. So it's not that, it's pretty quick. And there will be a free short story made available from my publisher between the releases of the two books. I don't know the exact date yet, but that will also go on social media. And it's a pretty meaty adventure set about midway through the first book, before Kagen meets Took while he's still alone. There's a side adventure, and I love me some werewolves, and I had a fun time writing Kagen versus werewolves.
Very cool.
That was fun.
Very cool.
Super cool. Well, we always appreciate the time. Keep writing amazing books. Matt and I will keep gushing over it and try to figure out what villain we actually like and what hero we want to stab. So it's a good mix, and we appreciate it.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. This has been a whole bunch of fun. Anyway, I gotta fly. This has been so much. I can hang out with you guys all day.
Problem.
Yeah, you guys rock.
That's not. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Great interview. A lot of fun. I feel like I made some friends, and this was great. I'm so glad you guys liked the book.
I loved it. And keep in touch. And I'll see you at Dark Delicacies. I've got that on my
calendar. Cool. So. Nice. Sounds great. All right, guys. Take care.
Take care.
Yeah.
Bye.